thanks to the organizers for having me. Before I launch into some of the astrophysics, I just want to say that there's this expression that we have in America, which is soft diplomacy. So basically, like international scientific collaboration is a form of soft diplomacy where Americans go and we make friends and we show that we're nice and we try to get people to like us. So in a time that I think hard diplomacy seems particularly hard, I very much appreciate this opportunity to do a little soft diplomacy. So thank you for that. Okay, this feels very loud, but okay. All right, so I am going to talk about the Hubble tension and evolving dark energy. Oh, that feels better, thank you. And kind of give a state of the tensions. Where are things right now? All right, so I want to give three main ideas, two of them first. So one is that we have this great standard model cosmology, where if you look at a variety of probes, they all seem to kind of line up. This is this nice plot showing omega lambda versus omega matter. Everything kind of seems to be on top of each other. But then if you poke at it, either from a theory side of what is dark energy, or what is dark matter, or kind of now that we're looking very closely, kind of from an observational side, there's no real good answer. So it's this kind of strange thing where we have this simple, wonderful, empirical model, but it feels kind of not satisfying, and now we're really pulling at it, and it's unclear what's going on. So that's kind of my top-level idea, and then I just want to give one more kind of thesis takeaway, because we haven't talked much so far today about the evolving dark energy signal, and that's gotten very exciting over this last year and a half. And I'll say that the Hubble tension's been around for over 10 years now, so I've been working on it for, I think, like 12 years or so. It's, I think, very well poked. I think poking is very important. The evolving dark energy signal has been around for about a year and a half. And I think it's still in early days of poking. So that's kind of going to be my overall feeling about what's going on, and I'll kind of take that through. Okay, so the way that I like to always kind of give the introduction for the Hubble tension and cosmology is with like a child's growth chart. So here we have a measurement of the universe when it's very young, just a few 100,000 years after the universe began, in the form of the cosmic ray background. We also have these exquisite measurements of how the universe is looking today. That's something like that my team works on, so that's what we refer to as the Hubble Constant measurement. And then we have our standard model of cosmology. And the whole idea is that if everything is going right, then we have this end-to-end test where we could take our picture of the universe as a baby, we follow our standard model up, and we can predict what we see today. And the problem is that the end-to-end test fails. And there's three obvious explanations. One is that the team measuring today is incorrect. One is that the team's measuring for the pictures when the universe began is incorrect. And the last is that the standard model is incorrect. And I think by far the most exciting one is that the standard model is incorrect, but that is a very serious claim, and it needs to be tested in a variety of ways. Okay. All right, so I want to kind of focus it through the lens of type 1a supernovae, since that's what I grew up on, and they also are critical for both the Hubble tension measurement and the evolving dark energy measurement. So for type 1a supernovae, we find them through this process, what we call image subtraction. We just keep taking pictures of the sky. There's lots of galaxies in the sky. We look to see is anything different, and likely that difference is an explosion from a supernova. If it's the right kind of supernova, we call that a type 1a supernova, then that's what we call a standardizable candle, and we could get a distance from it. So we measure the brightness over time, and that's what we call a light curve, and then we measure some properties of this light curve, and we could get a distance out of it. Okay, so then we measure the distance from the light curve, and we measure the redshift, usually from the host galaxy. There's a postdoc, Rebecca Chen, who's here. We'll give a poster about this tomorrow, about getting redshifts. And then we could just make what we call a Hubble diagram, which is distance versus redshifts. And this encodes in it various, a description of how the universe is expanding that you could compare against models. So In blue, that's showing a model where the universe has only dark energy. In yellow, that's only matter. And we're in between, where we have some amount of dark energy and some amount of matter. Okay? Now, the kind of two key points are that the expansion rate kind of closer to today, things local to us, if we just measure that slope of distance versus redshift, that's what we call the Hubble constant. Okay? Whereas, let me just go back. I lost it. Shoot. Whereas the change in the curve, that's what gives information about dark energy. So it's kind of the first order is H naught, and we used to call the second order Q naught, but now we parameterize it using a more sophisticated model of dark energy and dark matter. Okay. All right. So how we have gone about this over the last 6 years is really, since we're using supernovae both to try to measure H naught and kind of Q naught, or dark energy, dark matter, really we kind of combine all this together. So there used to be these two teams. One was called SHOES, another was called Pantheon. Then with the help of people like Adam Rees, Dylan Brout, we've merged that all together. We call it like Pantheon plus SHOES, where you saw earlier this morning, there's a 3-rung distance ladder where 2 of the 3 rungs have type 1a supernovae, and those supernovae are the same supernovae in our normal Pantheon Hubble diagram. So kind of from my point of view, from the supernova side, we just try to analyze supernovae as best as we can, and those will be both important for measuring H naught, where you're not going to as high redshift, you're going to a lower redshift, and for dark energy measurements, where you're trying to kind of really take it out to as high redshift as you can. Okay? Now, another key difference that I'll show on the next slide is that in the distance ladder, you're kind of really comparing supernovae that are in galaxies with Cepheids to supernovae out in the Hubble flow. Okay, so I've been saying this point for like, 12 years or so, and I feel today it's kind of at its most important, which is what's more challenging, the measurement of dark energy, or W, the equation of state, or H naught? So the answer to me has always been obvious, that W is a much harder measurement. And the reason is that for W, what we're trying to do is kind of measure the shape of this slope over a large redshift range, and differences on the scale of like 0.02 mag are the difference between lambda CDM and some evolving dark energy signal. So if you're doing this measurement over this large redshift range, what you have to do is you have to combine multiple samples where you have to worry about evolution and different filter systems and a lot of calibration issues. So it's supernovae all across this big redshift range. For H naught, though, the size of the tension is about 0.2 mag. To give you a kind of sense of that, the discovery of the accelerating universe, which was, 27 years ago or so, that was about 0.25 mag. So it's a whopping big signal, and I like to think that kind of over the last 25 years, us astronomers have gotten better. But it's a kind of similar size signal, and you only have to kind of measure that difference over a redshift range of about 0.1, where you're using the same surveys. You don't have to worry about evolution. The systematics are much less. So kind of by design, H naught is a much more kind of easy to detect, both in scale, but also in lack of sensitivity. Okay. All right. So I'm going to kind of talk about Pantheon Plus and dark energy measurements, and then we'll transition into H naught. In Pantheon Plus, we saw that the equation state of dark energy W was consistent with the cosmological constant, and that was kind of our top level result. But then we also saw, if we look at the first order expansion, where you kind of do W naught and WA, there is kind of some pull away from a cosmological constant, where that's W naught of -1, WA of 0. So it's about 2 sigma deviation. We talked about maybe where that could come from, and we left it at that. Since that paper, there's been 2 other big analyses that have come out. One is from the Dark Energy Supernova program, and this has a independent high redshift supernova sample. So in blue here, this is showing what's from DES compared to Pantheon. And you could, whereas it's not an independent low redshift sample. It has many of the same supernovae, and it has this extra kind of challenge where a number of the supernovae are not that good kind of supernovae, type 1a, and there has to be all this cool Bayesian machine learning type stuff to get rid of that. We feel pretty good about. This is an analysis that Maria Vincenzi led for DES. Okay. What this found with DSY5 is that same pull that we saw in Pantheon Plus, it's kind of pulling even more away from the cosmological constant. Now this is combining DESI plus CMB plus different supernova samples. DESI plus CMB themselves give a 3 sigma pull away from the cosmological constant. So this is kind of independent of the supernova story. And then if you combine it with supernovae, you can kind of get even a little bit less pull away from the cosmological constant at Pantheon Plus, or kind of you're getting to 4 plus sigma if you're getting to if you're using DSY5, and there's this other analysis called Union 3, which is somewhere in the middle of those two. So this has gotten people very excited that there's kind of 3 supernova samples that are all telling you the kind of the same thing, which is saying the same thing as what DESI is saying. Which has gotten people very excited. Okay, now a big caveat to that is that these supernova samples are not independent. So for DS5 year, that has a independent high redshift sample, but the same low redshift sample, and does kind of very similar type of analysis, what I call like a simulation-based method. For Union 3, the sample is almost identical to Pantheon Plus, but does a full version of its own analysis, does this Bayesian hierarchical method, which it calls unity. So it's not like you have 3 supernova samples and you could root 3 down. Really, I'd say that they are, I don't know, I'd say 1.5 times the supernova sample. So I'd say kind of, it's still, we haven't entered the phase where we have these new totally independent things to check on them. But it's very intriguing, and it's particularly intriguing that DESI plus CMB sees the same thing. Okay. Now, this has gotten a lot of people very excited. One of them that's always checking the most anytime anything breaks lambda CDM is George Estapio. And he wrote a paper saying, is this evolving dark energy or systematics? And kind of his prior is always on whichever thing shows lambda CDM is right is more right. So in this case, it would be Pantheon Plus. And he found that there's an offset on the order of 0.04 mag from low redshift to high redshift if you look at the same supernovae that were in DES and Pantheon Plus, and that would be a systematic. Maria Vincenzi then helped lead this analysis where to check that. The problem is that when you use the same supernovae but in different analyses, then they're kind of treated as part of a different ensemble. So you're not really an apples to apples comparison isn't totally right. So half of that is kind of doing this kind of apples to banana comparison. And then the other half of it, we attribute to actually improvements that DES did that we think is right of DES compared to Pantheon Plus. So it's not obvious that DES, which is kind of pulling further away from lambda CDM, has done anything wrong. If anything, the kind of couple changes that clearly changed from Pantheon Plus, we would do that again for DES. The analysis, I think, to keep the biggest eye on, there's a paper just last week. It's called Dovecki or Dovki. I don't really even know how to pronounce it. It's my former grad student. His name is Brody Popovic. And he tried to reanalyze all the filters in the different photometric systems and compared to kind of when people analyze them in Pantheon Plus. And overall, sees very good agreement on the level of a few, 5 millimags or so. But shows that when you go to a large redshift range, these small offsets can get scaled up by like 6 times to 0.03 mags or so. And what you could see here is that these can actually lead to signals that start to look like big changes in cosmology. So this, if someone would redo my analysis here and get this, I was thrilled. But the supernova sensitivity across a big redshift range is really strong so that you could get these big shifts. Now, Brody is redoing the DS analysis. You have to kind of do it part of this full package. But I think kind of anything that I'd be keeping my eye on about whether this evolving dark energy signal can last or not, it's this one. Okay, so now transitioning to H naught, well, H naught and Q naught, or Q naught, we call that W plus omega matter, they can be fit all together. And what's nice is that because we have supernovae for both the H naught measurement and the W measurement, we can do all this. We can do all this together. And we did that in the Pantheon plus shoes analysis, where we fit H naught and Q naught. So we say basically, well, we don't know exactly what dark energy is. Let's just kind of have some open parametric model. And when we do that, our H naught doesn't change that much. It actually goes up a little bit, 73.3, compared to our baseline of about 73. So by saying, hey, we're not totally sure what dark energy is doing, actually, when we looked at it, we saw that H naught could go up. Now, you could put in a different model, like this new W naught WA model, and different things will happen. So this is actually very interesting. This was in the DESI paper, where they combine different data sets, like DESI plus CMB, or DESI CMB plus Pantheon plus, and they allow W naught and WA to float as well. And what's particularly interesting about this is that when you do this, actually, for the two ones that pull more towards non-cosmological constant, Union 3 and DSY5, actually H naught goes down. Look at Union 3 here, it goes down significantly. So if you want to allow the W naught WA signal, actually it just makes the Hubble tension worse. Now, if it was the opposite case, I would have been jumping up and down saying this whole thing is over. But unfortunately, the W naught WA signal seems to be making the Hubble tension problem worse. That's if this parameterization is correct. So these are not kind of two things that go together. Actually, they're kind of fighting each other in this weird way. And yeah, if I had kind of one wish of how this all would play out, it would be the opposite story here. But this is right now the universe that we got. Okay. Okay, so how sensitive is this measurement to systematics? We heard earlier about kids systematics. Can something like that happen here? Okay, well, in Pantheon plus shoes, we tried looking at everything. Here are all the kind of variants, the kind of systematic coin flips, if you would, of different things. And you could see that we weren't seeing almost anything that could even take us beyond 72. And importantly, kind of for every step along the distance ladder, you could replace it with someone else's team's work, and everything seemed pretty robust. We keep this big Google spreadsheet that's totally open for anyone to look at all the papers that have reanalyzed us. At some point, we got so stressed out about all the reanalyses that we decided just to track them, and we've been tracking them to this day. And I mean, there's, I don't know, 50 or something crazy. So we give all the papers and what we thought about them, what H naught they got, and links. So if anyone has their own idea of how to solve all this, check that it's been done first already. Okay, the most discussed one has kind of consistently been that, well, Cepheids are crowded. I think this was even mentioned this morning. And what's nice is that with JWST, the resolution is much, much better. And you could test this systematic idea to see if that's been a problem. And this has kind of been pretty amazing that, if you think there's some crowding systematic, that would look like this here. And now if you compare JWST to HST, it's all these points here. And you could see the agreement between HST and JWST is phenomenal. There's no obvious crowding effect. And we definitely now have these kind of further very crowded ones that look very good. If anything, it's kind of pulling to slightly higher Hubble constant. So I think we didn't think that crowd thing was a big deal just because it's kind of just like sky, background sky. But it's kind of always been brought up. And at this point, I feel like it's been beat down pretty well. So the signal that rules this out is 8.2 sigma, which is bigger than the tension signal itself. It just doesn't make sense anymore to invoke this as the idea. Okay, so we kind of were feeling very good about everything. The YouTube community, though, is getting very strong with the Hubble tension. And anytime a paper comes out, they really let us hear about it. What's amazing to me also is if you just can look at the number of views. Like, I always think that no one cares about our stuff, but it's amazing to see that that there's 430,000 views on this one, 219,000 for Sabine's. People are watching how we talk to each other about this, and this was when a CCHP paper, or I think first their presentation, and then their follow-up. I can't remember where this was, saying, okay, maybe there's no more crisis in cosmology. Okay, so I want to kind of launch into this a little bit, but before I get in, I want to say kind of one thing which I find very difficult, which is that oftentimes when we're talking about the tension, it's always like Planck versus Shoes, or Shoes versus CCHP, or Friedman versus Rees. It's always very sports-like, where it's just like two teams just battling each other. I do not feel like this is a good, healthy way of talking about this. I think this, we're all part of a community effort, and also I think it does a disservice to a lot of great work, like the work you heard from Brent Tully this morning, of all these different teams that are working on it. So I do want to kind of try to refrain from that type of language of one team versus the other, because what ultimately happens is that people like me and others on my team, we hear it and we think, oh yes, we have to be enemies because everyone's telling us we are. So it's not great. But in that context, what you could see is that it's not two teams. There's a number of teams with a number of methods, and whether we're talking about Tully-Fisher or surface brightness fluctuations like you heard about this morning, or masers, and kind of everything seems to be pulling in the same direction. One more that you probably heard about just last week is a kind of very different measurement. This is with strong lens measurements. And this was just from a nice CosmoVerse that Anwar Shahid, but I think Martin Millen talked at. And they spent the last 6 years or so checking every bit of their measurement. And they find they get kind of somewhere between 72 to 75 at about 2 sigma from Planck. So this is totally independent systematics from what we do in Pantheon plus Shoes. This is strong lens measurements. Okay, so the big question has been, okay, well, now that people are starting to be able to use JWST, what can it really help answer? And what it can do now is it's not measuring supernovae. It's really measuring rung 1 and rung 2, and it could do cross checks. It's a systematic checker at this time. And if you want to make it like a good statistical measurement, then you need to beat this 42 supernovae that we have in rung 2. So really what it's for is for checking systematics, not for doing its own H-naught measurement. And I think that bit has gotten confused. Okay, so the question one has been, well, does JWST measurements of non-Cepheid techniques, or JWST Cepheid measurements, compared to HST Cepheid measurements? And that's what we're showing here, of whether you're using JWST Cepheids, or TRGB, or JGB, or MIRAs, and they all have very good agreement with Cepheids, showing no obvious problem with Cepheids. I mean, and this level is at the 0.01-ish mag level. Remember that the Hubble tension's at the 0.2 mag level, 0.18 level. Okay, another question has been, well, maybe there's some nonlinearity that Cepheids have. Well, now that we have all these other cross checks, we could check that, and we get a slope of about 1. So nothing obvious there either. Okay, so if you hear about these different H-naught values, well, where do they come from? And where it comes from is this confusion about whether JWST can do H-naught measurements or just be a systematic check. And the issue really is this middle rung where you're tying Cepheids to supernovae. And supernovae, a single supernova has a lot of scatter, just from measurement noise and some intrinsic part. And if you just measure TRGB and supernovae from a few galaxies, you're going to get these random noise fluctuations. This is just small sample statistics. So there's an expectation of what you should get if this is in units of H-naught. If you measure, I know, just this one and this one and this one, your H-naught will be biased high. And it's just by only measuring a few different galaxies that have supernovae and your distance ladder technique. Okay, so when CCHP was looking, and they said, oh, for these small samples of calibrated galaxies, we can get lower values of the Hubble constant. We say, oh, well, what would we expect you to get for those same galaxies with our Cepheids? And this plot we're showing in the the line versus the square, the circle versus the square, that's showing what they get versus what we said they should get, and we show that there's excellent agreement. There's excellent agreement because actually what is being checked with JWST is in very good agreement, and it's just the rest is small sample statistics. Okay, so we could go one step further and say, okay, well, in what one can actually measure between Cepheids and other things, is like what I showed before. Let's just combine all the data that we can between Cepheids and TRGB, and what you could see here is that things just agree extremely well. Like they're all around 0. So there's no, for all the kind of talk there's been about some Cepheid TRGB difference, at this point, when you're using the latest, best data, on average, they agree really well. So we could say, all right, well, what about the Hubble constant that you get? Well, we could say if you combine all the data that you have of just TRGB, not Cepheids anymore, then the Hubble constant that you get is something above 72. So for kind of when CCHP or others say that, well, they get lower values of the Hubble constant, what often happens is that they either have a small sample or they're not including some supernovae. So in this last analysis that Xiang Li led, he was not he showed that there are a number of supernovae they were not including for some reason, and those are all on the higher Hubble constant side. If you include them, everything goes back and converges back to the mean. Okay, so I'd say kind of overall this whole debate about Cepheids versus TRGB, I just don't see it anymore. And I'd say, if anything, the story has been, well, how big is your sample of supernovae? And are you following those fluctuations properly? But if we want to try to kind of move further away from supernovae, there's this really interesting paper that came out by Desi, and they tried building their own distance ladder. And they said if you can measure coma, if someone could measure coma, which you heard about a little bit from Tully this morning, then they could anchor their fundamental plane measurements, which is a different kind of galaxy distance measurement, to coma. And when they did that, they get a value of the Hubble constant of 76 with these small statistical uncertainties, but this huge uncertainty due to calibration of not knowing a good distance to coma. So when you heard this morning about coma being important, this is one of the reasons why. Once you have coma, then that's like one of the best anchors for a distance ladder, and you could get a very small rest of the uncertainty budget as long as you beat this down. Okay, so what I want to do is say, hey, can we just measure coma better? And I love this paper that came out this last year. And the idea is that normally you have this distance ladder where you're measuring Cepheids or TRGB in galaxies that have supernovae, and then you go out into the Hubble flow as supernovae. For a coma-based distance ladder, we could say, hey, let's find supernovae in coma, and instead of going out into Hubble flow, we're going to use the Desi Hubble flow and measure the Hubble constant from that. So we're still using supernovae, but in a very different way. We're only measuring supernovae in one particular cluster, the coma cluster. We could also say, let's go backwards. If Planck is right, then we could take our Desi fundamental plane galaxies and predict what the distance to coma should be. So we say, let's start with the H967, and then we basically do a reverse distance ladder. Okay, so the big question then is, what's the distance to coma? And there's a number of supernovae that have exploded in coma. We did a search for them. This is what it looks like. You can see it's just like a beautiful cluster here. And we measure all the light curves, is what I talked about in the beginning. We find a standardized brightness for every supernovae. So there's 12 total supernovae. And from the 12 supernovae, then we could get a distance, a calibrated distance to coma. And what's particularly amazing is that the distance that we get is about 99 megaparsec. And if we did that thing where we predict what Planck would say that we should get, it predicts that we should get about 112 megaparsecs. So this kind of changes how we think about the Hubble tension. It puts it on this different level of just like, coma is this cluster that's been kind of what we say in our backyard. It's just a question of how far away is this nearby thing that people have been measuring for a long time. So we got this value of 99, but because coma is so nearby, the astronomy community has been measuring coma for decades. And we could say, all right, forget about us. What has the astronomy community been measuring? Not knowing that coma would be such an integral part to the Hubble tension story, right? This is like a truly blind measurement because no one knew that coma would be this important. And what's amazing is this is the historical measurements of coma. And not a single team has ever measured a value of the distance to coma as high as what Planck would predict. So like compiling this to me was just awesome that people have been doing this forever, and no one was trying to get a certain value of the Hubble constant. They're just trying to measure this cluster that was nearby, and no one has ever seen what Planck says it should be if the Planck cosmology was correct. So if the Hubble tension story is real, which I think it is, these kinds of things should happen, where just these surprises, where suddenly the coma cluster becomes really important, and then you could go back and say, well, what have people said the coma cluster, how far away it is, and turns out that it doesn't match up. It's just a kind of new manifestation of what the Hubble tension is. So this kind of compiling different historical measurements from the literature, and you could see that always kind of people are below, and this is just a new reframing of the Hubble tension. Okay, I'd say that this kind of issue is popping up in other ways instead of with the fundamental plane, because Tully Fisher. And I just kind of want to make one key point here, which is that now, because supernovae are evolved in evolving dark energy, people are like, supernovae must be bad, and that must explain the Hubble tension and evolving dark energy, even though those signals go in opposite directions. But in terms of the Hubble tension, what's particularly interesting is that if you replace the Pantheon plus supernovae with just about anything else, whether you're doing other kinds of supernova measurements, or Tully Fisher, or fundamental plane, or surface brightness fluctuations, it always goes up. So I think it's very weird to say, hey, the problem is supernovae, when if you replace it, the problem just gets worse. Okay, so I just give an advertisement. Kind of this point is stressed a lot. There's this new paper that people are working on. Eleonora here is working on it with Stefano Castano. I think they're called like the C3 team. I wasn't sure what the name was. But what they're trying to do is take away supernovae or take away different things and show what it looks like. And you can see it seems very robust. What could be causing this? I don't know. This is why I'm here. I think the biggest pushback I get is that people won't believe an experimental result unless there's a good theory to explain it. That I hear this all the time. It bothers me to no end, but it seems to be a fairly common viewpoint. I'll just kind of end with this note. There's now this possibility that dark energy is interesting, that there's some evolution. I say the local universe looks pretty normal. I think there's still kind of these possibilities on the early side, but more and more is getting ruled out. There's the SPT measurement that comes out tomorrow, so that'll be interesting to see. But it feels like this area is starting to get boring, and this area is starting to get boring, and this area is now exciting. But if you asked me a year ago, I would have said different things. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I wanted to get your view on what I'll call post-processing of the cosmological supernovae, where people start cutting data sets and they say, we'll only look at supernova above some redshift or otherwise cutting. And in particular, the idea that the cosmology fits really come from a global fit over light curve modeling parameters and everything else. How dangerous is it to post-process, having someone who knows nothing about supernova just start cutting the likelihoods at the end?
Right, it's a great question. And kind of one example of that recently, is DESI used, I think the DS year 5 supernovae and then tried cutting the low redshift sample, so from a supernova person's perspective, we try to make it so that you can do that, but because there are all these kind of global nuisance parameters, it's like not totally kosher. But I do feel, now having kind of seen this happen, especially over this last year, we don't do a good enough job of making it so people can cut. So in short, I'd say I would work with the supernova community to do this, but I think the supernova community has done not the best job of making that easy. And so when people do it, it's hard for me to say you should have done this better because we don't make it that easy for people to do better. But I definitely think that's something in the next year, like with this Dovecki reanalysis, one thing that we're going to try to do is make it so you can cut however you want, and you don't have to, the outside supernova community doesn't have to worry. But it's very much something on our mind that we have not done the best with.
There's another question there.
Okay, thank you for the nice talk. You talked about the comma cluster as an independent evidence for the DESI plus comma cluster as independent evidence for H naught. Is there any measurement of the distance to the comma cluster that is completely independent of distance ladder? In other words, all these that you showed, is there any of them which does not use at all distance ladder method, local astrophysics for calibration?
Right. I think, great question. All of these, whether you're using TRGB or SBF or Cepheids, so purple, red, and blue are all independent techniques, but they're all, I think, what you would classify as the distance ladder. But they're very, to me, they're very different. TRGB and fundamental plane is very different than using surface brightness fluctuators. So they're independent within themselves, but they're still a distance ladder.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Daniel, once again.